Well, I've given you a personal case study illustrating how the change triangle, the situation, heart and God, works. And now I want to illustrate these dynamics at play from a letter in the Bible, from the letter of James, chapter 1, verses 1 to 18. I want to zero in and look at these dynamics as they play out. Now, James, like the rest of the New Testament writers, has a pastoral heart, and he's writing to real people with specific struggles that they're facing. Now, it's quite interesting that James doesn't dump a truckload of information on his readers about who God is. He's not even close to being comprehensive in talking about who God is. There's a lot more to say, but what he does highlight is things that specifically relate to their struggles, their situational struggles that they're facing, and their internal heart struggle. So he highlights who God is to them in light of those things, clarifying God's perspective on their situation and on this internal battle that's going on within them. Now, it helps to know that James is a prominent pastor in Jerusalem, and he's likely writing to those under severe persecution. So the kind of circumstances that led to an early Christian by the name of Stephen being stoned to death in Acts chapter 7 and 8, that's the kind of stuff that was going on around this time. Well, what does James say to them in this passage? Well, first, we'll look at the situation. And he starts by saying, expect trials. Let me read to you verse 2. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds. But it's not just an expectation of trials that James is wanting to expect, to explain the normality of what they're facing. He's actually explaining that these very trials serve God's purposes for the Christians he's writing to. Take a look at verses 3 to 4. Because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. The very fiery ordeals James's readers are facing are to be expected, and they're actually serving God's purposes in maturing their character. But James also highlights what's on the other side of these trials, an incentive for these Christians to keep trusting God in the midst of them. Take a look at verse 12. Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, because having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him. So there's this great reward in view at the end, in light of this grand restoration that God is working towards, that they're to keep in mind. But in verses 9 to 11, James says something that might surprise us. In these verses, he actually speaks of blessing, the experience of having wealth as a trial. Let me read to you what he says in verses 10 to 11. But the rich should take pride in their humiliation, since they will pass away like a wild flower. For the sun rises with scorching heat and withers the plant. Its blossom falls and its beauty is destroyed. In the same way, the rich will fade away even while they go about their business. So the experience of being wealthy is actually something that James sees as a trial as well, for he knows how short-lived wealth is. He's got this long-term picture, and it's also part of the situation. It's also a test for those who find themselves in a situation of blessing and having much. What does James say about the heart? Well, in verses 13 to 15, he's going to tease out the difference between external testing of circumstances and temptation, which actually comes from what is within us. Let me read to you verses 13 to 15. When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. Then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. So external testing through trial does come about by God's hand, but not temptation. The experience of temptation is actually a result of the desires that battle within us, what's ruling our heart at any given moment. And that's what leads to outward expressions of sin. Well, how about God? What does James say about God? Well, we've already seen that God is the one who's bringing these particular trials about, these moments of testing, so that he might have his maturing process accomplished as life is lived out. But God also promises wisdom, help appropriate to our experience of trial in the midst of it. Take a look at verse 5. If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. So God isn't stingy or disinterested in the lives of his children as they face severe testing. God is ever present, and he's offering wisdom, help appropriate to the situation to help us navigate it. And he gives that generously, and all we need to do is to ask. Now, James anticipates that his readers might be being tempted to be cold and cynical towards God under this severe testing that they're facing. And as if he's expecting that they might be coming to false conclusions about God and his character, he reminds them of God's goodness in verses 16 to 18. Don't be deceived, my dear brothers. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. He chose to give us birth through the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of all he created. He's wanting his readers not to draw false conclusions about the character of God to them in the midst of what they're facing. God is still good to them, and he's working out this grand purpose that he has of restoring all things. This grand purpose is being played out even in these moments, and it's still being accomplished. He's still loving them, and he's still redeeming them. Well, there you have it. The change triangle from James chapter 1, verses 1 to 18, looking at the situation, heart, and God.